Para mim, como é que... Professora Conceição, sim, sim. Sim, sim. Primeiro a falar. Desta vez eu vou fazer como a Fátima fez e vou para ali. Eu me senti atrapalhada. Eu realmente sou cega como... Enfim. E tem isso? Manuel? É este? Ok.
Good morning, all. Good afternoon. So it is a pleasure to welcome you all to this third WhatIf' International Conference. I thank Dr. Ana Moura for this concept and for the work. She had to, a few days ago, she had to, I hope I'm not telling an inconfidence, being confidence, but she had to walk her dog at 4 in the morning. 2 days ago, right? You had to walk your dog at 4 in the morning. So just to tell you how this being workloaded, how she has been workloaded. So I thank you, Ana Moura, for the concept, for the work. And I also thank my warm thank to the team of the Faculty of Sciences Library. Well, I'm not giving you titles, but Celia, Isabel, Lina, Gilberto, Manuel, Joana, Julia, thank you. Thank you very much for your work always behind these events. Thank you very much. I also would like to acknowledge the support of the Vice Dean for Culture of the University of Porto, Professor Fátima Vieira. She has been always with us with high support. The concept of what if is particularly challenging and passionate. I was the first time I was told about this concept, I was I don't know. And that means that I really was not aware of what is the concept of what if means. Because this concept can help us to look at our stories and at our history. I learned to pay attention to details, for example, in that exposition, and it helps us to think critically, think on decisions that have been taken and are being taken in our days. But I think that this concept and this moment of what if must also be a place and a moment to critically question how history is being written, who writes it, and if it is being written, it is being perpetuated. But the freedom that I also felt that is associated to this what if movement or concept, I really don't know. But what I felt is that there is a freedom associated with the thinking. Is also a moment to think on dramatic events that are occurring today. For example, the movements about fake news, the movements about intolerance, and those movements that systematically think that there is only one truth, my own. So to think about this and to think about intolerance is critical for today. We are, therefore, more, and I speak for the faculty, and I speak for the team, more than happy. I think we are very proud to host this event at our library, beautiful library, at our faculty, and at our university. I believe you will have a fruitful conference, and once again, welcome you all in this, in our library, and please enjoy.
Good afternoon to all. It is a true pleasure to be here, despite my health, at the opening of the 5th WhatIf', the 3rd, as international conference. And I would like to thank, obviously, the director of the Faculty of Science of the University of Porto, Professor Ana Cristina Freire, and the director of this beautiful library of the same faculty, Professor Conceição Santos. WhatIf', as initiative, was a joint venture of Invicta Imaginária and Casa Comum of the Rectorate of the University of Porto. And my deepest gratitude goes to the Dean of the University, Professor António Sousa Pereira, and particularly to Vice Rector, Professor Fátima Vieira. My acknowledgements would not be complete without mentioning the remarkable team of this library, of the services of archives and culture. And I hope not to be unfair to call attention to Célia Cruz, Gilberto Silva, Isabel Sá, and Manuel Esteves. Thank you so much for mining the past until it gave what was lost. And what is lost could be another manner to rephrase what-if questions and the alternative chronologies and perspectives they bring. When we confront the absolute with a divergent possibility, we necessarily uncover what has been missing all along and likely did not let us go further. Because if those that do not know history are doomed to repeat it, then those that do not discuss alternative history are doomed to miss the early exit signs that precede the fall. But there is another reason for challenging the absolute. Yes, we have the research motivation, we have the intellectual challenge, we even have the creative appeal to explore alternative history in our field. However, all of them pale in comparison when you consider that one cannot be human and not hold dear in one's heart another human being with whom we had a good laugh. Joy, whether from creation, from the irony uncovered when stepping into a past that never was, through storytelling, brings people closer. You will never look at anyone as an enemy if you ever shared a laugh with that person. We at academia, we tend to overlook that joy and laughter are as much children of reason as are logic and mathematics. We fear sometimes that our work will be belittled if joy is associated with it. And that is another reason to walk the miles that alternative history proposes. We find our own cultural blind spots, sometimes ridiculous, but that does not belittle us. And learning from them with a shared laugh is the beginning of insight, and a shared laugh comes through storytelling. We at academia forget that joy is one of the strongest antidotes for fear, and fear blocks rationality. We forget to enjoy in exploring avenues for the fear of being ridiculed. At the 3rd International Conference begins, I invite you not to fear joy, rationality, but embrace both. in imagination and facts alike, as alternative history allows. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So this is going to be short, just a quick introduction. My name is Sofia. I'm going to be the moderator of this session. I'm a bit out of my comfort zone because I'm a sociologist, but let's see what happens. And now I'm going to call our two keynote speakers, okay? So I'll ask him to come, and we're going to start with the intervention by Rogério Ribeiro. He's a researcher, professor, writer, and anthologist, and his communication is entitled Speculative Biology, When Fiction Plays Dice with Evolution. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, yeah. So in a parallel alternate history, I was going to speak in Portuguese because I remember to ask the language of the slides, not the language of I was supposed to use. So let me see if I... Okay. So don't mind that image because in reality, it's there because I really liked it, but it's probably the image that has the least to do with what I'm going to present. First of all, let me thank the invitation to be here, both to the University of Porto and specifically to Ana Moura, which has been a dynamo in all these what-if initiatives throughout the years, and I see that it keeps growing and growing and growing, and all the best for everything that you intend still to do. But the invitation was very open into what we really wanted to talk. And so being a biologist and sometimes having run a little bit away from my initial career as a biologist, and also being a promoter of speculative fiction, I think it's a good opportunity for me to bring both sides together. And so to speak about speculative biology in this perspective of when fiction plays dice with evolution. So it's interesting because in the literature, many times speculative biology and speculative evolution are used interchangeably. So basically with the same meaning, which should not be correct, but at least is a field where we bring science and scientific methods into hypothesizing fictionally what evolution and what different kind of evolution we could have depending on different alternate factors from reality. And so it informs very well the what-if question. The term was coined in a specific body of work, which I'm going to speak in a few minutes, by a scientist and fictionist called Dougal Dixon. But in reality, we as a species have been doing speculative biology for many centuries, especially in ages of discovery, both when we were trying to discover new ways geographically, but also nowadays when we try to find new ways in space. And so we use imagination to fill the gaps of the unknown historically. And it's interesting because imagination with time always tends to coalesce into something near or far to what we imagined. And sometimes it comes into something very different but also very surprising. But if we go even further, when the hypothesis that there were another worlds started to be built, which was during ancient Greece, first there was the hypothesis that somehow there were other bodies in space that eventually could harbor life. And it's interesting because the first time it was written, at least that survived to our times, it was by Epicurus, and it was the other way around the argument. So he said that there was no pro or con definite reason for it to have or not to exist or not to exist life in another planet. So opening for the first recorded time the hypothesis that we could find life. Throughout the ages, always when life was imagined in different planets, it began to be imagined exactly as our own. So humans as ourselves, plants as our own, animals as our own. Of course, that started to change with Charles Darwin and the theory of the origin of the species. It was not the first theory trying to explain evolution, but it was for sure the one that caught both the science community and the general public more strongly. Of course, with a personal price to Charles Darwin. This is a cartoon of the time. I think I much more prefer this cartoon, which is more recent and was published by the New Yorker magazine. But in reality, this gave us the tools, the speculative tools, to think that if we are thinking in different planets, in different environments, probably we should be thinking about different life forms. And a few years later, when erroneously it was thought that we had found artificial structures in Mars, and so there were canals in a barren world, so that opened the possibility of a previous civilization. Then people started to think not exactly in terms of the human ecosystem, but eventually what came after. And right after that, H.G. Wells started to write some articles in magazines for the general audience, for scientific dissemination, putting forward and working his own biology, his own speculative biology of Mars, which is much less known than the novel that he ended up by writing of the War of the Worlds. But indeed you can see how this was the world building the society, building the life forms that ended up by producing the novel. He was a very important author in this respect of speculative biology and speculating about evolution. Of course, he has another work, which is The Time Machine, that deals with the evolution of man beyond what we know today. And in this picture, which I liked very much by a Japanese illustrator, we see the Morlocks and the Eloi, so having, of course, for H.G. Wells, the point here was social critique. But in terms of speculative biology and speculative evolution, it was very interesting what he done. This is the most well-known part of the book, but in reality, the traveler goes beyond. He goes until the end of times. And so it was very interesting that H.G. Wells could extend the timeline and look into the evolution of man in a time that his conclusion was that man existed no longer. So it was very interesting to see a world dying, but not man not existing anymore, being absent of these worlds. A few years later, in the 1930s, Olaf Stapledon was the first to truly that truly tried to capture the eons, let's say, of a possible human evolution. So making of humans a spacefaring species and then letting the different environments in space leading to a speciation and a divergency of the human race. So he ended up by describing 18 future human species that developed, that evolved throughout 2 billion years. And this was very interesting because it was also influenced by the fall of the Roman Empire. So you had expanding ages and ages where these subspecies started to lose contact among themselves, and then followed by new exploration times. And so that illustration is taken from his own notes, organizing the chronology of the 2 billion years. By the way, just as a curiosity, if you're interested, there's a very interesting, very nicely done short movie by Johan Johansson, a very well-known composer. That it was his first work as a director, and he ended up by dying before it was released. But I really encourage you because it's very atmospheric. But the work I was alluding at the beginning that really coined speculative biology as a term and speculative evolution was After Man, a Zoology of the Future, which was done by a paleontologist. And so really applying the scientific methods and the scientific reasoning into producing a work of speculative evolution. He then did something that is completely that completely fits into the what if alternative theme, which was the new dinosaurs. So taking into consideration the absence of the great extinction, and so following the evolution of the dinosaur species after not having that cataclysmic event. And then the third one, I think most people agree that probably we should forget it, even the author himself, Man After Man, which was, in terms of quality, much less interesting than the other two. But was trying to somehow envision future societies of humans, but was not that well produced. Dugan-Dixon became, of course, a great influence to people that work in the area. Another huge influence became Wayne Barlow, that has a great amount of books, but this was really the groundbreaking work called The Expedition, and where he took, basically his thought was trying to break away from the mechanisms of evolution on Earth, because what he saw was that other species were being created exactly with the same kind of architecture than the evolution on Earth seems to work. And so he tried to break away from that, tried to produce new architectures of life forms. But in reality, if you look closely at some of the pictures, they still give us some kind of familiar tone. We can always find an animal where we can find some analogy. Of course, this has to do with using environment as the stimulus for evolution. But I think nowadays, world building and speculative biology is done by many people. You find a lot of works, but many of them always go back to these two authors. And I just used two movies, which I think it's always easier to relate references. Both Kong Skull Island, which is very influenced by the work of Dugan Dixon, and Avatar, which is very influenced by the books by Barlow. And it's not a coincidence that both of them also wanted to publish the kind of work that was done to base the ecosystems and the worlds that they show. As I was saying, nowadays there are a lot of world building based on speculative fiction, on speculative biology. Probably one of the most well-known in the internet age is All Tomorrows, which also has had a lot of spin-offs going into the alternate history area. This one is taking the premise that somehow we contacted an advanced race of aliens that decided to start to genetically modify the human race. And so it follows several of these genetic modified human subspecies. So it's only the most well-known reference, but I would much prefer the previous works. Also a personal note, because there was this book which somehow doesn't seem to belong here, but totally belongs here. It was written by Professor Frausto da Silva, and it was when I went into the first year of biology, it was the textbook that we had for the chemist theme. This book is, I don't know how many chapters about everything that you wanted to know about the chemistry of life. And then surprisingly has a last chapter discussing other kinds of life forms based on, in this case, I think it was silicio, I think so. But basically discussing what other alternatives there was for carbon-based life forms. And not only doing that, but discussing, depending on the environment conditions, what could work and what probably wouldn't, what kind of compounds would interact, and basically allowed biological function to different life forms. And so for me, as a first-year university student, this was really, really surprising and goes into some of the themes that Anna was mentioning previously, that sometimes in academic life these kinds of speculation are not well regarded. So this in a textbook was really, really surprising. But I've been focusing a lot on biology-driven mechanisms, so evolution-driven mechanisms. And when I was preparing the talk, I remembered Schismatrix by Bruce Sterling, which is basically a confrontation between two offshoots of the human species. One that had evolved based on biology, and another one that had evolved based on technology. And so probably the eternal battle won't be between good and evil, but probably will be between technology and biology-driven evolution. But of course, not only because I'm a biologist, I like to focus on biology, and there was for a short time a niche genre in speculative fiction, which was biopunk, and followed by New Weird, which seemed much more successful for a time, and basically today it has stopped being a thing. But just let me mention three works, especially the middle one, which I think it's absolutely brilliant. So Ribofunk is a collection of short stories by Paul Di Filippo, which I think is the seminal work, at least the early work to look at speculative biology in fiction. Perdido Street Station by Sheena Mieville, it's, as I was saying, I think it's a brilliant book, and is a book where speculative biology becomes the background, and so it's there, it's very strong, but you pay attention to the characters and not to it. And to mention a more recent work, Born, which is the beginning of a series by Jeff Vandermeer, which, just to tell you that Born is an eminent. So it's very, the series of books is very focused on genetic modified beings. On the other side, we always tend to use speculative biology to think about how to make our own bodies more adaptable to the environment, and probably this will become, with the climate changes, more and more prevalent. And so just to mention two books, Man Plus by Frederick Pohl, and then Starfish by Peter Watts. One, the adaptation of the human body to space. The other, the adaptation of the human body to the depth of the Earth's seas. And I couldn't not bring these two books because they are, I think, very good examples of the cross between speculative biology and alternate history. And so we can use the cross of these two subgenres to talk about, as was said before, evolution and especially human history, how this would impact human history, to talk about mechanisms of health and mechanisms of disease and the impact that they have in shaping human societies, also in terms of cultural evolution, and lastly, ethical considerations, but I leave that to the last slides. And in terms of discussing human history and the cultural and even the impact of health and disease in shaping societies, I think the best two examples is The Years of Rice and Salt by Kim Stanley Robinson, which basically has the point of divergency in the Great Plague, basically not erasing almost everyone in Europe, but basically erasing truly everyone. And then Europe being colonized by the Chinese, which after 2002 and looking at today, we keep speaking about being colonized by the Chinese. But the other one is published in Portuguese. It's Civilizations. It's a French writer, Laurent Binet, and basically is looking at what happened in the invasion, the European invasion of South America and Central America, in this case, and not having that huge effect of a bunch of Europeans being able to topple civilizations. In reality, there was a previous contact with Vikings, which indeed happened in the north of America, but that providing some disease resistance to those peoples, and then the advanced empires that existed in Central America being able to do exactly the opposite. So being strong enough to resist Europe and then having an influence in Europe and the rest of the country, of the world. And so it's a very well thought, well written book, and has the added interest of having Portugal, that at the time was a superpower. And I would leave for you to read the book to discover exactly how the author handled having Portugal with so much power in this kind of situation. But the last point I was mentioning was using speculative biology and alternate history to deal with ethical considerations. And this is a work I liked very much by an Australian sculptor called Patricia Piccinini, who has been developing a lot of these sculptures, which are speculative biology, and crossing them with our own notion of human relationship. And so if I can finish the talk with these images, and probably with the closing remark that while evolution takes its time to do its work, let's use and allow fiction to play its dice, and let's play the dice with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rogério. In a moment, I think we're going to have the talk of Rafaela. Rafaela Ferraz is a writer, researcher, and an author. And the title of her talk is A Burning Question, Reimagining Portugal's Journey Towards Cremation.
All right, sorry, we had a bit of a technical issue here. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation to be here. It's been a really long time since I've spoken in public. It's been a really long time since I've spoken in any kind of academic context. So I ask for your forgiveness in case I forget any words, in case I make any mistakes. I'm going to do my best for you, and I hope we can take this to a good port. So my big question for you today, my burning question, is what would have happened if Portugal had legalized cremation much earlier than we actually did? Now, this may not seem like a very interesting question. This may not sound like much. But if I do my job right, and I hope I do, I hope you'll leave this presentation thinking that death practices have a massive impact on everything in our society, from the way we organize our cities to the way we mourn our loved ones, all sorts of questions. We're going to run through them, but first I would like to show you a brief map of where we're going today. So I'm going to start with a very brief history of burial in public cemeteries in Portugal. We're going to speak about cremation. It's a much shorter history that we're going to try to extend a little bit in this presentation. And then we're going to ask our serious question, what if cremation had been legalized a lot earlier, in this case in the 1830s? I have two potential answers. One is nothing at all would have changed, and the second one is everything would have changed. And I'm going to try and guide you through what everything means in this context. So let's start with this very brief history of burial in public cemeteries. Now, I'm not going to take you back very far. We're going to start in the 19th century, and I want to show you what a cemetery looked like in the 1830s, more or less. What we're looking at here, these images show a type of burial known as burial ad sanctos, so near holy places, usually in connection to the tombs of the saints or some site of religious significance. This was the leading form of burial all through the medieval era, and pretty much up until the 19th century, where everything suddenly changes. We have people gathered in urban centers, in cities. We have episodes of very high mortality. We have cholera epidemics. We have a civil war here in the country. And there's also a growing awareness of this little thing called public health, which I'm sure is very important in this faculty. But up until this point, we hadn't really thought about the potential health risks of burying our people literally inside the church, which we had been doing up until this point. Starting in the 19th century, we start to believe, no, this is not acceptable. We have to change this. We have to move into a new paradigm. And so in the 1830s, 33 and 35 specifically, the Portuguese government actually issues the first legislation that creates public cemeteries as we know them today. And there are two very important pieces in this legislation. One is the fact that cemeteries must be built away from urban centers. So not next to the church, not inside the church, not behind the church, quite far away. And the second very important point is that graves must be individual from here on out. So no more mass graves, none of that mess that I showed you in the photos. From now on, we have individual grave sites. And this is very important because as we start to have individual burial places, we are able to build monuments to our people. We are able to decorate. We are able to identify very clearly who is lying in each plot in our cemetery. This is going to be relevant in a second. A lot of the culturally significant cemeteries that some of us visit today for touristic purposes are actually built during this period. So the really big cemeteries that you've heard of, Prazeres, Alto São João, Agramonte, Praia do Repouso, I always forget one, I'm sorry. All of these date back to this period. It's worth mentioning, however, that there's very high popular resistance to this new legislation. Communities are used to burying their dead inside the church or around the church. They're used to finding their dead loved ones still inside the community. They still belong in the community, and physically speaking, they are still quite close to the center of the community, which is the church at this point in time. So communities are very resistant to the idea that we're going to bury our dead somewhere else from this point out. Eventually, this resistance subsides, and by 1910, public cemeteries are the leading form of burial in Portugal, and we haven't really changed them much since this period. Cremation has a much shorter history. We only legalized it in 1911 with the onset of the First Republic. So all throughout our monarchy, we had no access to cremation. We start having it during the First Republic. We built our first crematorium in 1925, so 14 years later. And we closed it down in 36. But in this period, we only actually conduct 22 cremations. So this doesn't sound like a country who was very excited to actually embrace this new practice. We reactivated in 85, and we built a second crematorium in 95. So all in all, it takes us 84 years to build 2 buildings. Now, to this day, Portugal has very low cremation rates, about 19% overall, close to 50% in larger cities such as Lisbon and Porto. You will notice, of course, that these numbers are previous or prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, which I believe may have had a strong impact on these numbers, but I don't have more recent information to bring you. I'd like to show you these 2 buildings, which are the first 2 crematoria that we actually built in the country. The first one in 95, the second one in 95. I think the differences between the buildings show pretty well how much time it took us to actually get to the second one. Now, my big question is, what if cremation had been legalized earlier, in this case, in the 1830s? And my 2 answers in this case are nothing would have changed and everything would have changed. Why do I feel that nothing would have changed is a valid answer to this question? Because as we've seen, populations were not particularly inclined towards new forms of body disposal. They just weren't interested. They weren't interested in public cemeteries. They were absolutely not interested in cremation. And there was also a very strong Catholic preference for burial, which lasts to this day, in fact. Even though the Catholic Church accepts cremation nowadays, there's still a very strong preference towards burial. And cremation is a practice that must follow a series of, how should I put this, conditions. So we may cremate our loved one, but then we can't keep the ashes at home. We can scatter them, for instance. The Catholic Church is still very attached to this idea of burial versus cremation. So this could lead us to another what-if question, which is, what if the country had taken a serious turn towards a more secular society? What if the real turn had been towards, or in this case, away from Catholicism? I can't answer that question, but I wanted to ask it here because I think it reframes the question that I'm trying to ask. What I'm asking you is, what if we had adopted cremation, and what would be the consequences of that? But if the country had actually taken a turn for a more secular society, cremation would be a consequence. It would not be the cause. So 2 different conversations, but let's go back to the original one. So why do I believe everything would have changed if we had become a cremation-first country, let's call it this way? The first question is, of course, the management of cremation ashes or remains. If we start cremating all our citizens, obviously they will take up a lot less space because a cinerary urn is about this big, and a coffin is obviously this big. But we still have to put them somewhere. So will we keep them at home? Will we scatter them in the ocean, in the forest? Will we bury the ashes in the cemetery, or will we store them in a columbarium? If you're not familiar, this is what a columbarium looks like. I have 2 examples. The first one is from Singapore, if I'm not mistaken. The second one, the USA. These are pretty elaborate, pretty fancy columbaria. And 2 examples which are much closer to us. The first one in Spain, the second one in Portugal, Oeiras specifically. Sorry, got ahead of myself for a second there. I want you to look at these images and I want you to notice how in the cemetery that we know today, where each person has, a plot, we have room for monuments, we have room for decorations, we have room for individualization, which does not happen here. And this is why I mentioned individualization earlier, because this would be a significant consequence of becoming a cremation-first country. How would we handle decoration and monumentation if all of a sudden we didn't have any grave sites to actually decorate and to actually, how should I put this, to associate with the people that we have lost? We would have fewer opportunities for decoration, for monumentation in Columbaria. And there's also the issue of if we actually decided to start scattering ashes, there is no gravesite all of a sudden. There's a complete dematerialization of the gravesite, which would influence our mourning practices from here on out. Imagine, for example, November 1st and other designated days of mourning. How would our practices change if all of a sudden we didn't have the cemetery as the centralized place of mourning that we have now? I would also like to think about the environmental impact. Both practices, burial and cremation, have significant environmental impacts, which I'm not trying to compare here because this would be a complicated comparison. But with burial, we have to think, for example, of the resources and materials that go into building the coffin. We have to think primarily of land use, which is massive, specifically in urban cemeteries. We have to think about the resources that go into actually maintaining the cemetery space. And we have to think about the potential for underground contamination. I'm not going to go into details here because we don't have a lot of studies about this in Portugal, and it's actually very complicated to compare from one nation to another because death practices change in very slight ways. Other countries use embalming, for example, so if you bury an embalmed body, you're actually burying a lot of formaldehyde, which we do not use in such high concentrations here. So that would be a different comparison. For cremation, there's also a strong environmental impact. There's the coffin, which you've mentioned. There's emissions, greenhouse gases, and plenty more, mercury and so on. And there's the issue of energy consumption, which is quite high for just one cremation. The economy would obviously be influenced by this choice, starting with a loss of revenue for public entities. Now, when we organize a funeral these days, we're paying for the funeral, obviously, we're paying for the coffin, but we're also paying for the actual plot where the person is going to be buried. And we are paying to a public entity, usually, either a junta de freguesia or a Câmara Municipal. These entities would lose a significant amount of revenue if we suddenly decided to stop burying people and start cremating them. There would also be an impact on associated industries associated with the construction of coffins, tombstones, and also, obviously, florists. I want to think finally about culture and tourism. And this may seem a little out of the box, but in recent years we've seen a growing interest in cemetery tourism, specifically in 19th century cemeteries, for instance, and in a place that you see here, and I don't know if you've had the chance to visit, our National Pantheon. Since the 1960s, more or less, we have been burying the bodies of some of our great figures in this building. But if our country was cremation first, there's a strong chance that we wouldn't have the bodies, or alternatively, there's a chance that we would be cremating most people and preserving the bodies of those that we actually deem to be valuable. So I believe this is an interesting question. If we had, a 99.9% cremation rate, what would we do with the National Pantheon? And regarding cemetery tourism as well, a lot of people like visiting cemeteries. I am one of them. And we visit for a variety of reasons. We visit because we may be interested in death as a concept. We may be interested in the architecture. We may be interested in art or symbology. We may be interested in connecting with history in a, in a closer way than we would in a library or in a museum. When I go to a cemetery and I visit the grave of a specific poet or writer or whoever, I'm actually, in a way, I'm in conversation with, not this person, but I'm in conversation with their monument. I'm in conversation with the symbols that the family has decided to place in this location. But But this happens because we have a form of death practice that allows us to individualize each individual burial space. With cremation, there's a chance that this wouldn't happen. So what would happen to our cemetery tourism? For me, that would be hugely impactful. I don't know about you. In conclusion, the decision to favor cremation over burial would have had a huge impact on a variety of levels: social, economic, cultural, and so on. However, historically, it doesn't actually seem very likely that this would have happened. It still hasn't happened. We have a 20% cremation rate, as we've seen. I think the 2 points that I want to make here is that the impact of legalizing a new practice or a new form of burial will not necessarily, or in other ways, legalizing a new practice will not necessarily have a real impact if there's a mismatch of values between the government, who's actually written this piece of legislation, and the people who are now expected to practice it in their daily lives. Now, there is obviously a follow-up question, which is, what if cremation had been made mandatory in the 19th century? I'm not going to answer this. I'm going to leave this question to you, for you to think about as we go. I would like to thank you for your time, and I leave you not with a scam, it's just my website, in case you'd like to look at it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Rafaela. And also thank you, Rogério, for the wonderful talks. We still have time, so I would like to know if anyone wants to do some questions, make some comments, or if everyone is shy. I don't know. Okay. So if not, maybe I would start. First of all, I would like to say that I really enjoyed both of your communications. Like I said, I'm from sociology, so maybe my approach will be a little bit off from what you were talking about, but please correct me and then we'll exchange some ideas. Maybe I will start with Rogério and then I'll do some questions to you, okay? So, Rogério, as you were talking, it's impossible not to think about the concepts of utopia and dystopia when we think about speculative biology. I have some questions or comments, and you feel free to answer as you wish. Something that I've been thinking about recently is the importance of using concepts such as utopia, dystopia, and then speculative biology to do research nowadays. How can the past or new ways of looking and interpreting the past and even the future can be of help while we're doing research today? And also, the main question that I wanted to ask, for example, if we think about even works of Huxley and Brave New World and so on, and Orwell with 1884, something like that, we are talking about other ways of telling about our society. And even when we think about like artistic works, like the last one that you showed us, they are also ways of critiquing and resisting and telling the ways that other people might live, like in utopian and dystopian worlds. So I really wanted to know what's your opinion on this, if you think this.
So it's very tricky when we talk about utopia and dystopia because there's always, like in the works of H.G. Wells, there's always the argument for whom. Because sometimes one person's utopia is another person's dystopia.
Yeah.
Which was the case in the society that the time machine showed. But your comments made me remember that indeed sometimes biology and speculative biology are used for, let's call it utopic reasons, especially when you want to emphasize questions of race. And when in our recent history, world history, having pure races was so meaningful. And it's very interesting because I completely skipped the 1950s and 60s and 70s, because I think the kind of science fiction that was being done based on speculative biology was very geared towards politics and these kinds of discourses. But if you think about, especially in movies, most movies that you can identify with the concept of mutants, for example, there were always pure humans and mutants, and usually those were the divides between good and bad. Of course, nowadays, especially with superheroes, you have a different kind of mutant and a different way to use speculative biology to try to discuss questions of society. But in all those decades, even when people were not trying to focus it, that was what they had in their minds. I lost the second question, sorry.
Yeah, it was regarding
because
that
it was the idea of conceptualizing and showing. I think the work that I showed goes much more into questions of human interaction and relationship, especially the fact that you have when you have the first view of a person, you don't see exactly the character. And so I think it's very interesting because everyone, as different as they might be, that if you interact with them enough time, then it becomes familiar. So it goes over that unknown.
And how can we use that perspective, for example, when we think about teaching or even doing lectures like this? How can we use literature or speculative biology from not just a scientific point of view, if you know what I'm...
No, you can do it in a scientific point of view. I think it's well, in reality, it's trying to use it to show that sometimes what you consider different, it's not that much different, and you should be paying probably attention to other things.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And now, Rafaela. Yeah, sure.
Turn this on. So I have a question. You used an expression that I really enjoyed, that I thought was really interesting, this idea of a battle between biology and technology and how this might play into evolution. I wanted to know how this interacts with concepts of, for example, transhumanism, this idea that we're going to transcend our limitations as humans, as a species, that we're going to live forever, that we're going to defeat illness and so on. How do you think about this, and how do you think this fits into the subject that you've presented here today?
Well, traditionally, it's much more related with the technology-driven evolution than with the biology-driven evolution, and so I think it's interesting in the way that you want to accelerate, because we are still evolving. Something I didn't mention, but for example, our brain capacity is, and again, to destroy something that is a myth, which is evolution is linear and has a single direction. So when you think about transhumanism, you think about the continuation of the positive evolution of man. But in reality, evolution is not linear. And so, for example, nowadays, some studies indicate that our brain capacity is going down and not continuously up. There are theories for this. I think my favorite one is because we are starting to externalize a lot of knowledge, and so probably we won't need as much brain capacity. We just need processing external knowledge, let's say. But I think it goes with our society nowadays that wants everything very fast.
Thank you.
So, Rafaela, As you were talking, I was also thinking about two questions. You mentioned the fact that the grave, it's like a symbol of individualization. And I agree, and I also wanted to know what is your opinion? Also, what if question to your work? Because from my perspective, some of the graves that we see in cemeteries are also a symbol of economic power and social status, and etc. And I also wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit more about what if cremation was implemented earlier, how that would affect those types of social inequalities, for example, if you have thought about that in your work.
So, hugely interesting question. Obviously, I find that the idea of individualization, when it was first implemented in public cemeteries in the 1830s, this is implemented and this is thought about by people who are an intellectual elite. It's in their favor that the grave will be individual, because up until that point they hadn't been necessarily exposed to the risk of a mass grave, because mass graves were for poor people, people who didn't have any economical power. In other words, the rich have always had access to individual graves, but from the 1910s and so on, we all start to have access, in theory, to this individuality. Now, the point of diversion, if you will, is that I don't actually believe that if we had implemented cremation, that a lot of intellectual elites would have chosen it for themselves. Because the idea of memorializing yourself in a building, the way so many people have done in the huge cemeteries that we have in Lisbon, in Porto, the way these families have chosen to memorialize themselves, to build a monument to their own memory and to their name, does not feel compatible in any way with the idea of, we'll cremate our dead and that's the end of the story. It doesn't feel compatible to me. I wanted to bring up the idea of the National Pantheon because I feel like that's a point where we can have this conversation. If we suddenly decided to cremate everyone, would there be people that we would decide not to because we want to keep the actual physical memory of their body, for example, because we want to use their body as almost a tool of propaganda to place somewhere and say, this is a great person, a great figure of our country. We have an example, for instance, writer Saramago, for example, he was cremated. So he's not actually in the National Pantheon, even though a lot of people argue that he should be, but there's nothing to put in there. So the most we could possibly hope for is maybe a little plaque. But if he does go to the National Pantheon, he's not going to be there physically as other writers, as other politicians are. So this idea of individualization is much more complex than I alluded to in the presentation, and it's definitely influential in all of the ways that you mentioned.
And also, like you were talking about it now, when we think about collective memory, what's the importance of having physical objects and also physical bodies as a way to perpetuate collective memory in the future? For example, what is your perspective regarding cremation? What would the changes be in that process of remembering the past, but as a society, for example?
I think it's definitely a huge challenge because as we start to adopt cremation, we are starting to adopt it in a way because we don't have access to cemetery space. We can't expand our cemeteries anymore. So the only option, or the only viable options, the only financially accessible option in many cases is to cremate the body and then decide what to do with the ashes. Maybe we'll keep them at home, which will obviously compromise any semblance of public memory. And I kind of lost my thought process there for a second. I'm so sorry. I forgot what I was going to say. I completely forgot. I had this so well planned out in my head. No, but this idea of public memory, obviously, there's a huge swath of population from the 18th century, 19th century that we have no access to in the cemetery space. They're not there. We can't find them. If you go to a cemetery in Lisbon, for example, and you want to find... It's hard to find any women, for example, who are buried by themselves. It's hard to find anyone from a racial minority. It's hard to find people from religious minorities. All of these groups, their impact on public memory has always been hugely how do I say this? Not reduced, forcibly reduced in a way because of the way we have done death practices up until this point. And I believe that with cremation, if we find that people are choosing cremation because it's financially more accessible, then obviously this is exactly the group of people who was not going to get memorialized anyway and is not going to get memorialized from this point forward. So we have to find alternatives. We have to find digital alternatives, for instance. We have to find a way to perpetuate the names of these people, the cultures that we have lost. But cremation is definitely a huge obstacle to this idea of public memory. And I think about this a lot in big cemeteries such as Alto de São João, for instance, where huge sections are temporary burial sections. So you are able to bury a body for, say, up to 5-10 years, perhaps. And after that period, the body must be exhumed and the bones can be incinerated, placed elsewhere, and so forth. All of those people who are buried now, if you visit them now, you do have access in a way to the physicality of them, to their memory. But in 10 years, you're not going to find them anywhere. In 15 years, in 50 years, you're not going to find them. So that's definitely a huge obstacle and a huge question that we must ask ourselves. Okay. Thank you.
I also have a question. Because I was hearing you, and I was thinking of probably one factor, which is, I think, that our relationship with those practices that you were mentioning regarding death are naturally eroding. When you talked about the holidays where people go to the cemeteries, I was comparing what I experienced as a child and what I experience today. And also, you took an utilitarian view, which was, for example, one of the benefits would be to spare space. And what if we decided to not spare space and use space differently, especially in the relation with nature, which different societies have much more in these kinds of cemeteries? So would you think that could be an evolution? Because you were saying that one of the cons would be the loss of revenue. I don't agree that the state would not find some way to make up for that revenue.
Okay, so 2 questions. About the issue of space. In recent years, we have definitely seen new ideas regarding new types of cemeteries, new ways to use cemetery space. One of the really big concerns regarding the land use associated with cemeteries that we have today is the fact that they are often placed in urban areas. There's no room for expansion, so they are completely landlocked. And often, as you see here in the city, you have a huge cemetery in an urban center. That's prime real estate for someone. Someone would certainly like to buy that place and build a mall or a parking lot, I'm sure. But there are definitely alternatives, such as green burial, natural burial, woodland cemeteries. All of these are new alternatives that we are starting to see pop up right now, mostly in Canada, the UK, the USA. I believe some in Australia and New Zealand. It's a very Anglo-Saxon phenomenon. I do believe that natural burial can be an option, but I don't believe it's ever going to be an option for everyone. First, because I don't think most people are sufficiently invested in the idea of death and death practices to actually look for an alternative. So what we're seeing now, and there's actually a very recent study on this here in Portugal, people are not necessarily choosing cremation because they're not Catholics, for instance. They are choosing cremation because it's easy. They're choosing cremation because they can choose this death practice, and when it's done, they have a little box, and it's done. It's closed. So they don't actually have to go to the cemetery on November 1st. They don't actually have to take care of a grave. There's that erosion that you were that you were mentioning. It definitely exists in all of these practices, and it manifests in the decoration and the actual care of graves, and it manifests in these choices. So I'm not sure that people are that motivated at this point to actually go for practices that are objectively better, which would be, for example, natural burial is a fantastic use of the space because for those who are not familiar, woodland cemeteries are basically natural landscapes. We use them for a specific period of time to actually bury bodies in the most natural way possible. So there's no coffin, there's no embalming, there's no chemicals. Usually the body is buried either in, say, a cardboard coffin or a very lightweight wood coffin, or only in a shroud, nothing else. And once that space is occupied, filled up, we move on to the next plot. And this space is now protected area, and it's protected woodland. So you can actually build there, no parking lots, no malls, nothing. But it's also not a slice of the city that's occupied and that no one can actually develop anything on. It can be expanded anywhere. I do believe that woodland burial and natural burial is objectively better in many ways. I don't think we're quite there yet to make it happen in a significant scale. Thank you.
Okay, so does anyone want to ask a question? Okay. Yeah.
Considering the continuous it doesn't matter. Considering the continuous biological word, Rogério, evolution, how do you imagine burials?
I don't actually know, but I'm not sure I imagine burials.
I know you've thought about it.
I don't imagine burials, in fact. For the future, I don't believe burial as we know it today is actually going to extend very far into the future. What we're seeing right now is that as many companies, and usually it's always private companies, this is important, and they're always somehow associated with technology and tech developments. What we are seeing right now in terms of new developments and new death practices, none of them have anything to do with burial, and they are all much more closely associated with cremation. So we are seeing, for instance, some countries are starting to legalize something called liquid cremation, also known as resumation, for instance, where the body is essentially liquefied in a basic alkaline solution. I don't know the science, I'm sorry. This is one of the options that we're starting to actually see right now. It's being legalized. I believe it's actually in use in some states in the US. I believe it will start being practiced in the UK very, very soon. We're also seeing I don't actually know what the word I'm looking for, but a lot of people are currently interested in something called human composting, which is essentially burial. You've heard of it?
I can imagine.
Yeah. So it's...
I'm not referring to humans. I'm referring to the, in case tech wins over bio tender. How do you imagine?
Well, I don't. I've only ever worked with human burial, to be honest, not even animal burial, so I can't actually say. I do believe it would be absolutely awful to imagine a future where, say, we have augmented humans of all types with, I don't know, mechanical arms and mechanical brains and so on. I believe it would be absolutely terrible from an environmental perspective to actually bury them, but that's an uninformed opinion.
Okay, so does anyone want to add something? Okay, yes.
When the burials stopped happening inside churches and moving Thank you. So when Portugal decides to stop burying people inside churches and move them outside, we actually had an uprising of women, right? The Maria da Fonte. So taking into account that who we see today at our cemeteries, taking care of their loved ones' camps, are usually elderly women. If cremation was to be made not just legalized but mandatory today, should we expect an uprising from our elderly?
It's very unlikely, actually. We had a very small sample of this during the COVID-19 pandemic, where our current cemetery practices and our funeral customs were very highly conditioned by what happened during the pandemic. So all of a sudden we couldn't have a wake, or if we had a wake, we could only have, 10 people in there. a lot of bodies that were cremated, for instance, the families couldn't actually accompany them all the way to the crematorium, for instance. They were just carried honestly like merchandise, placed in the crematorium, and then someone would deliver the ashes to the family sometime later. And obviously we didn't have any uprisings, but I can't actually tell you whether this has had a psychological impact or a societal impact on the people who experienced. I hope it's not the case in the group, but many of us know people who lost loved ones during this period. Many of us lost loved ones during this period. And the personal experience that people relate is that it was the worst funeral they've ever been to, because they couldn't actually say goodbye, because they couldn't actually, the customs were not there. There was a huge break with what people were used to. So I believe it would be catastrophical in many ways if we suddenly made cremation mandatory. I don't know about uprisings. I think it would be very funny if old ladies suddenly decided to rebel. But I do believe that it would be justified, because we were very attached in the 19th century to our death practices. We are still very attached to them today. We saw it during the pandemic. So I do believe there would be some sort of pushback, though I don't know how serious, to be honest.
Thank you. I have one for Rogério too. So, when you were doing your presentation, you showed pictures of mythological creatures that have been in the Portugal culture for centuries, and you also showed us books and movies. And I was also always recalling some TV show or movies that I have seen. So, could you say that although people are not exactly aware of the concept of biological speculation. Thank you. Could you say that's kind of we are always thinking about it without realizing?
I think so. So even when we think about these mythical creatures, or when we think about dinosaurs, and so everyone remembers Jurassic Park. So there are always people trying to bring back or to produce these chimeras, and so to make concrete and real things that we have in imagination or existed a long time ago. So I think in many things we are exposed to speculative biology, even though we don't use the term or we don't think it as such.
And we keep creating it for saying so. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're right on time. I would like to thank once again to Rogério and Rafaela for the wonderful talks and also for this incredible debate. I would also like to thank Anna for organizing this event. She's a bit dead right now, but that's okay. And so that's it, and thank you very much, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you.